Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And for those who are watching on video, you will notice that I am sitting in a seat on an airplane as my background, because today we are going to take a 30,000-foot view of Masechet Bava Batra. Many of you have been learning this Masechet for a very long time. I think we can say nearly half a year, which is pretty remarkable. So mazel tov on the upcoming siyum. And what I would like to do is I'd like to take this bird's eye view of the Masechet and ask what the Masechet is about. The way that I'm going to do this, it is impossible to look through the Gemara and tell us what the Masechet is about. That is way too winding, too many tributaries to go down. But if we look at the sequence of the Mishnayot and specifically what each Perek is about, we will find that Bava Batra is about relationships. While we might want to focus on the financial aspect of Bava Batra, truly, I believe that the financial aspects of Bava Batra are actually a lens through which to view the way people treat each other. So I want to take a look with you at this overview and try to give you a sense of each section of the Masechet. What relationships is it focused on? Okay. So I've divided it here into Perakim 1 to 3, Perakim 4 to 7, Perakim, let me move this out, 8 to 9, and Perek 10. Okay. Now, Perakim Aleph to Gimel are very much about the relationships between Shutafin, people who are partners in something, in the ownership of property, shanim, neighbors, people whose property abut each other. And once we start talking about chezkat shanim, how it is that I acquire somebody else's property by living on it, or I evidence my acquisition of that property, then we are starting to talk about the relationship between buyer and seller, right? In those relationships of partnership and neighbor and buyer seller, what we're really focused on is the use of property and what I would call your neighborhood, right? So when we go to Perek Aleph, we see that there are shared financial responsibilities among residents, right? So we're really talking about people who share a property together. You might, as one of those financial responsibilities, you might have to build or rebuild a mechitzah. You might have to pay in for the cost of some protective measure for your joint property, like a beit sha'ar or a delet or a choma. But there's an element of we share this, and therefore there's a financial responsibility. In Perek Bet, we talk about being a good neighbor. How do I use my property, and how is my property limited, my property use limited based on my neighbor's needs? For example, perhaps I shouldn't be planting too close to my neighbor's property. Perhaps I should be concerned if there are certain bad smells that are emanating from my property that will end up impacting my neighbor's property. And then finally, we move into this sort of previous owner, current owner, or buyer, seller, or gift giver, gift givee, when we talk about chezkat shanim, the 3 years that I'm on someone else's property, or what was considered someone else's property. And the question there is, how do I gain ownership over someone else's property, right? So those 3 all start me off on certain relationships of neighborliness that relate to land. When we move to Perakim Daled to Zion, chapters 4 to 7, the focus really is on buyer and seller specifically. And buyer and seller specifically, what we're worried about here is not how do I treat someone else's land, not how can I be a good neighbor, not what's my financial responsibility to someone else, but rather what is the sale process and what are the assumptions in that sale process. In other words, the focus here is not on neighborhood as it was in Aleph to Gimel, but the focus is on transaction and what's engaged in that transaction. So when we look at this relationship between buyer and seller and what's assumed in their transactions with each other, we'll notice that there's kind of a chiastic structure, like an ABBA structure from 4 to 7, because the bookends, Perek Daled and Perek Zayin, they both start with a conversation about land and acquiring land. And Perakim Hey and Vav start with a conversation about buying non-land, okay? So let's go through it. As we're doing the relationships between buyer and seller, in Perek Daled, we start with when you sell land, such as a bayit, such as a chatzer, such as an ear, such as a sadeh, what is presumed or assumed to be part of that sale? What aspects of that land area are included and what's excluded? When you go to Perek Hey, we start talking about that same question. When you sell something, what's included? But instead of talking about land, we're specifically talking about non-land. We're talking about selling a sfina, a boat. We're talking about selling a behema, an animal. What I find really interesting is that you even find the sale of ilanot, of trees, but specifically a case where you only bought 2 trees, so the land around it is not included. Perek Chamishi, the 5th Perek, also adds something to the conversation. Rather than looking atomistically just at what's assumed in a transaction when you sell a house, when you sell a city, when you sell a field, when you sell an animal, when you sell a boat, when you sell a wagon, it actually gives you some big ideas about the transactions and the expectations. So it offers you, for example, arba midot b'mochrim. There are 4 different ways that a transaction can go down, as it were. One in which the seller can renege because of something, one in which the buyer can renege because of something, one in which neither of them can renege, and one in which either of them can renege. So that's also giving us sort of big ideas, assumptions. Additionally, this Perek starts to talk about at what point is the sale complete, right? Meaning, at what point does the new owner bear financial responsibility, right? So the assumptions of transaction. When we move to Perakim Vav and Zayin, instead of talking primarily about what's included in a sale, it starts to talk about measurement and use. So for example, what's considered a rounding error when you sell fruits? And what I mean by a rounding error might even be you assume that some of the fruits are just going to be bad. What's the number that you assume, right? And the use question is really interesting because it's possible that you as a buyer and I as a seller do not leave this transaction as completely separate people. It's possible that actually in some ways we become neighbors, which takes us a little bit back to Perakim 1 to 3, but we become neighbors because there's something that I own that I can only get to through your property, right? So what are the assumptions? This sort of goes back to Perakim 4 and 5. What are the assumptions in terms of what's included in what I sell you? It's also what are the assumptions in terms of my use, that like how exclusive is the use of all of your property if I can only get to my property in a certain way. And Perek Zayin also talks about measurement, but goes much more into the question of measurement of land. How do we measure using a rope? What if you give too much? What if you give too little? Can you say, I'm giving this to you more or less, and therefore it creates different assumptions around measurements. But suffice it to say, Perek 4 to 7 focused on the relationship between a buyer and a seller and focused on the assumptions of their transactions with each other. Okay. Now, I think you could argue, by the way, for putting Perek 3, which was about chezkat gimel shanim, into either 1 to 3, which is sort of about neighborliness in a way, or in 4 to 7, which is about transactions. And I think that's actually why Perakim is a very good transition from Perakim 1 and 2, which are clearly about neighborliness and partnerships, to Perek 4 and 7, where it's so clear that there's a buyer over here and a seller over there. And chezkat gimel shanim, in the middle, number 3, chapter 3, sort of has this element of, well, are we partners in this land? Like for the first 3 years, for the first 15 months, 16 months, who really owns it? You own it, but I'm on it, right? So we share the land, but also there's a buyer and a seller, or a giver and a givee, or a giver and a recipient, right? So it's really interesting to see the way chezkat gimel shanim is a really good transition between, the relationships of neighbors and Shutafin to the relationships of a buyer and a seller. When we get to Perakim 8 and 9, we actually start to get to a different kind of relationship. Instead of talking about a relationship that is primarily defined by, where you're living, neighbors, proximity, or what financial transaction you're going to make, the relationships that are defined in Perakim Chet and Tet are relationships of family, right? The family relationship, meaning parents and their children, husbands and wives, siblings among each other. And because that is the topic and it's inheritance, and that's really the focus, what we also get in there is kind of 2 other subsets, which are really interesting. One is a subset of family. There's actually a conversation about sivlonot, when people are expected to get married and a gift has been given to the in-laws. That's not inheritance, but it is a family kind of relationship, something that comes because of family. And you also have a second subcategory, which actually is not family, but it's just about the relationship to someone who's dying. So you have matnat shchiv meira, the gift of someone who's dying. It doesn't have to necessarily be a shchiv meira. You can, somebody who's looking ahead at the fact that they're going to die, someone who might want to circumvent some of the laws of Yerusha, of inheritance. What are they going to do, right? So I would say when I look at what the focus is here, the focus is not neighborliness as it was in Aleph and Bet and maybe Gimel. The focus is not transaction as it was in Daled through Zion and maybe Gimel. The focus is on continuity, right? Someone is going to die and other people are going to get their possessions. And family is a major focus of that continuity. So the way it works is Perek Chet and Perek Tet seem to be working in some sort of sequence, because in Perek Chet, you have an introduction that's sort of the basic requirements for Yerusha, for inheritance law, right? Who inherits and from whom does one inherit, right? A basic conversation about the possibility or impossibility of getting around inheritance law, right? That's like a basic welcome to inheritance law, right? Then in Perek Tet, you have contested or divided inheritance, right? We start talking about sons and daughters, the sons being Yorshim, inheriting, and the daughters being Mizonot, getting food. What happens off the estate? What happens if there isn't enough to go around? We talk about what happens when older sons are doing business with their Yerusha. How does it impact sons who are still minors? We have this wacky, almost like Wizard of Oz-like situation where a house falls on people and their 2 relatives, and The respective yorshim of those relatives each argue about who died first, and therefore which of them should actually get the Yerusha, right? Contested and divided inheritance. You also have matnat shchiv meira, which matnat shchiv meira, I think in some ways, it's not contested and divided inheritance, but it's actually divided possessions, right? Meaning the possessions that aren't going to go into Yerusha because they've been given, right? So we continue along this route of the relationships, the first two prakim, at least, about neighbors, Perakim 4 to 7 about a buyer and seller, Perakim a little bit of both. Perakim 8 and 9 about family and a relationship to someone who's dying. We also have the change in focus. Perakim 1 to 2, maybe 3, the focus is on neighborliness. Perakim 4 to 7, the focus is on transactions and their assumptions. Perakim 8 to 9, the focus is on continuity or discontinuity, as the case may be. What's fascinating to me is when you get to Perek Yud, because Perek Yud, given its focus on shtarot, given its focus on contracts, actually has so many relationships that it engages, both the relationships that have been spoken about in Perakim Aleph to Tet and new relationships. So, for example, we have lots of spousal relationships, whether it's a get, whether it's a shovar, meaning a receipt for her ketubah, whether it's the tnaim before the wedding, whether it's the ketubah or the nedunya, the dowry, right? Lots between spouses where shtarot come into play. We also have relationships of people who are working on other people's land and giving them a percentage of the yield. So what we would call sharecroppers or arisim, kablanim, they have shtarot too. We have shtarot that are between litigants in a court of law, like a shtar berurin, where we have a shtar that says this one chose this dayan, this judge, this one chose that dayan, this judge, right? We have shtarot that come out of Beit Din that are called ma'aseh Beit Din. We have a shtar kiyum that is mekayem if somebody loses their original shtar, for example, saying this person is owed money, their shtar was lost, or their shtar was nimchak, it was erased, and here's one. And then this is the best to my mind, because in some ways, maybe it returns us to the beginning, maybe it doesn't. We have two random people. If you have two people named Yosef ben Shimon, can they take out a shtar chov on each other, a debt contract on each other? So in terms of relationships, what we've basically gone from is the very beginning, where we're talking about people who live right next to each other or on the same land. And we've moved all the way to shtarot that can engage any sorts of relationships very close, very far. And of course, we have the lender-borrower relationship, which is probably the most typical version of what a shtar might be used for, and the buyer-seller relationship, which has gone all the way through since Perek Gimel, right? The other thing is, in terms of not just how we've moved in relationships, but how we've moved in our focus. The focus at the beginning was about neighborliness, 1 to 2, maybe 3. The focus in 4 to 7 was on transaction. The focus in 8 to 9 on inheritance was about continuity. And now the focus in 10 is on evidence, because a shtar serves as evidence. So I think that it's rather remarkable to see how a Masechet that is so technical, that has so much fine print, is actually trying to mediate relationships of so many different types. The closest relationships you have, your family, the person who shares a yard with you, and perhaps the most random relationships you have, like you and I happen to have the same name, or I happen to need, to borrow some money and I'm looking to borrow, or I'm sharecropping from you, which maybe those relationships become tighter over time, but they're certainly not family relationships. And it's also intriguing to see that not only has this very technical Masechet taken us through fascinating relationship mediation, but it's also taken us through different aspects of and dimensions of the need for mediating relationships, specifically, I would say, when finances are at stake, right? We have the issue of, well, we're living right next to each other, we're each paying. How are we going to keep from making the other person's land devalued? And so the focus on neighborliness is not saying hello in the morning. The focus on neighborliness is not making your neighbor's land devalued or underprotected, as the case may be. We have the focus on transactions. We use words. What do we assume those words mean? We make agreements. How are we going to avoid the pitfall of, well, when you sold me that house, I thought it included X, but you didn't think it included X. So how are we going to set some expectations? I open up what I bought and I see that a tenth of what I bought is rotten. Is that something that I have to accept on myself as a responsibility as the buyer now? Or is that something that you as the seller have to be responsible for? Right? So also that question of what's assumed in transaction. Then the question of continuity. When we're talking about finances, we're not talking about continuity. Are your kids going to, follow your legacy? We're even talking about simple financial continuity. People earn money, they buy possessions. What happens to them when they die? What happens to those possessions financially, and how are relationships often impacted by those decisions, right? It's literally all right in there. And then finally, we get to shtarot and we say, okay, it's one thing to try not to devalue your neighbor's property. It's one thing to focus on the expectation of a transaction. It's one thing to work on continuity from one generation to the next, or it's even within the same generation, but from the dying to the living. But for all of this, because we're talking about money, we need evidence. And if we were talking about personal status, we would also need evidence. But the point is, we're talking about something that is a very tangible and valuable commodity. And we need evidence in order to maintain those relationships the way that they should be maintained. So true, Masechet Bava Batra is not going to give you the touchy-feely parts of relationships. It is going to give you how Halakha is trying to set up a system so that relationships can stay intact, professionalized, and with expectations that are reasonable. I hope you really enjoyed your learning of Bava Batra, and I wish everybody Mazel Tov on their upcoming Siyum.